In this interactive video, we're going to take a survey of some of Kierkegaard's most famous, most influential ideas across a series of his books. We're just going to take a little sampling of them so we can get an idea of where Kierkegaard was coming from. And Kierkegaard obviously is our next in the lineup of existentialist thinkers. And we'll begin with one of those School of Life videos, which do a really good and quick job of giving you the rundown.
Søren Kierkegaard was a brilliant, gloomy, anxiety-ridden, often hilarious Danish 19th century philosopher, the author of 22 books, of which 3 continue to make his name. He was born in an immensely wealthy family in Copenhagen in 1813, the youngest of 7 children. Death was around him constantly from a young age, and was to obsess him throughout his career. It is, in a sense, his only theme. Not only was he extremely physically frail, by the time he was 22, all his siblings had died, except for he and a brother. It drove him to furious production of books over 15 years. On a single day in 1843, he published no less than 3 works. He wasn't writing for the money, he was working to save himself, and, he thought, humanity. As it happened, he made it to the age of 42, then died of an excruciating spinal disease. In Either Or and Fear and Trembling, what Kierkegaard wants us to do above all is wake up and give up our cosy, sentimental illusions. He systematically attacks the pillars of modern life, our faith in family, our trust in work, our attachment to love, and our general sense that life has purpose and meaning. His enemies were the smug in all their guises, particularly the prosperous Danish haute bourgeoisie and the members of the established Danish church. He tells us, "As I grew up, I opened my eyes and saw the real world, and I began to laugh, and I haven't stopped since. I saw that the meaning of life was to get a livelihood, that the goal of life was to be a high court judge, that the brightest joy of love was to marry a well-off girl, that wisdom was what the majority said it was, that passion was to give a speech, that courage was to risk being fined $10, that cordiality was to say you're welcome after a meal, and that the fear of God was to go to communion once a year. That's what I saw, and I laughed." Kierkegaard was especially caustic about the 19th century understanding of love and the new ideology of passionate marriage, which aimed to unite desire with prudence and suggested that one could enjoy all the thrills of a love affair and at the same time all the stability of a long-term relationship. But Kierkegaard mocked the notion that one could ever fuse romantic love with marriage, that one could have passion and sex, and at the same time children, stability and routine. He respected both. He just couldn't believe that you could have them both at the same time in a cozy marriage sanctified by the state and the neighbours. His belief arose out of his own tortured love life. He fell in love with a beautiful, precocious and talented 18-year-old girl called Regine Olsen, only then to break off the engagement as he realized that to try and live with her forever would also mean killing the love that had drawn him to her. Everywhere he turned, Kierkegaard saw intolerable incompatibilities and impossible choices. It led him to one memorable explosion in Either Or. Marry and you will regret it. Don't marry, you will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you will regret it either way. Laugh at the world's foolishness, you will regret it. Weep over it, you'll regret that too. Hang yourself, you'll regret it. Don't hang yourself, and you'll regret that too. Whether you hang yourself or don't hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the essence of all philosophy. The mention of laughter is not a coincidence. Key to Kierkegaard's philosophy is that the only intelligent, tactical response to life's horror is to laugh defiantly at it. Rarely is a philosopher taken humour as seriously. Kierkegaard is often described as the founder of the philosophical movement known as existentialism, because in him we find all the themes that would so interest later thinkers like Sartre, Camus and Heidegger. The book that fascinated the existentialists was Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844, in which he emphasized a new word, angst, or angst as we know it in English, a condition where we understand how many choices we face and how little understanding we can ever have of how to exercise these choices wisely. As Kierkegaard wrote, Life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. Our constant angst means that unhappiness is more or less written into the script of life. As he wrote, "Anyone who has given the matter any serious thought will know that I'm right when I say it's not possible for anyone to be absolutely and in every conceivable way completely content, not even for a single half hour of his life. No one has come into the world without crying. No one asks when you want to enter the world. No one asks when you want to leave. How empty and meaningless life is. We bury a person, throw 3 shovels of earth over him, drive out in a coach, drive back in a coach, and console ourselves that we still have life enough left to live. But really, how long is 70? Why not just get it over with straight away?" For Kierkegaard, there was, however, one answer that he put forward ever more stridently in his later works: Jesus Christ. Kierkegaard loathed the Christianity of the established Danish church, but he adored the simple truths of the Gospels that his father had taught him as a boy. For him, Christianity was a religion of extreme surrender to a theology of almost peasant-like simplicity. One was to be ready to die for Christ, to give up all attachment to worldly things, and to love all humans like one's siblings. Kierkegaard wasn't interested in justifying his attachment to Christianity through rational means. Instead, he recommended a dramatic and now famous leap of faith, wherein one wouldn't apply one's puny mind to attempting to prove the existence of God. One would merely switch off one's faulty rational faculties and jump into the idea of God as the total solution. As he put it, to have faith is to lose your mind and to win God. Like Marxist communism, Kierkegaard's solutions to the problems of being human are far less convincing and interesting than the diagnoses of our ills. Few of us now make that leap. But Kierkegaard deserves our attention for the beautifully bitter, caustic look he cast on the human condition. He's one of the few philosophers one can turn to when the world has badly let us down, and we're in need of a friend who can fully understand the dark places we're in once the sentimental illusions that normally keep us going fall away.
So that video did a nice job of giving an overview of his thinking. But once again, Kierkegaard, who lived from 1813 to 1855, is considered the father of existentialism, even though he certainly didn't call himself that. And he was a Dane, he was Danish, and his work crossed the boundaries of philosophy and theology, psychology, literary criticism, devotional literature, and fiction. Um, he was a religious man, but not a dogmatically religious man. He looked at Jesus Christ as a philosopher from the past. And as the video mentioned, he despised the trappings of the church. He liked the philosophy of Christ, in particular, the New Testament. And he wrote mostly under pseudonyms, Victor Eremita and Johannes de Silencio and Anticlimacus. And this one I could barely even read from here, but I don't remember which one this is. But here's a series of his more famous works listed here. Now, his overall aims throughout his entire body of work were to provide insight into the meaning and fulfillment of human life. Like what the perennial question, what makes life worth living, and what makes it genuinely satisfying for the individual who's living it. Right? So here we see that existentialist turn from rationalist, abstract, universalist, reason-based concerns to concrete existence, right? So he thought that people living in his time, in the early 1800s, were especially unable to attain the meaning and fulfillment of which they were capable for reasons, for economic reasons, social reasons, habitual reasons, technological reasons. human beings were falling short of meeting even a fraction of their own potential. And he also said that a lot of this stems from this phenomenon he called leveling. And leveling is a collapse of qualitative distinctions that are accepted by society as a whole. So, some examples would be the difference between fine art, like we're talking about, let's say, oil paintings, right? Fine art versus schlock art, or just crap art that somebody spits up on the canvas and calls art for art's sake, right? He looked out and said, whoa, we're starting to lose the distinction between, um, for instance, an artwork, a piece of work by Raphael versus something like, let's say, for argument's sake, Andy Warhol, right? Of course, Andy Warhol wasn't around here, but he started to notice that, hey, we're just lumping this all together as art in the same category. Fine art and schlock art, it's just art. We're losing these distinctions. The great writers versus hacks, right? Let's say perhaps Dostoevsky versus, I don't know, because I don't want to offend anybody's taste in literature, but any pop paperback novel, right, that plays on your emotions to get you to keep reading, for instance, right? It's like we're losing these distinctions. Or virtuosic music versus just assembled noise, right? Music that really took scholarship and study and practice and depth in order to commit to the airwaves versus attempts to just get you moving to a beat and recycled ideas. And encyclopedic scholarship versus intellectual tourism. Point is, he said, we're leveling out all of these qualitative distinctions for some reason. And as such distinctions are leveled down, we lose any generally accepted bases for making the kinds of commitments that would give our lives a point and a sense of direction and impart in us a point of view, right? For instance, let's imagine you want to be a painter. And if there's no qualitative difference, if people aren't making qualitative differences between fine art and schlock art, then what do you have to aim for? Just get in the door and it doesn't really matter because it's all just somebody's opinion, right? Whether it's actually fine art or schlock art. You can tell I don't really agree with that, and I agree more with what Kierkegaard is saying. But nonetheless, if if all the goals and the qualities are just leveled down, what is there for us to strive for? And who are we going to model ourselves after to get, for instance, better and better and better at something? But also, many of his writings were a reaction against Hegelian idealism. And we talked about Hegel a little bit in the background of existentialism video, as kind of like the culmination of the rationalist project and the culmination of really abstract, reason-based, reason-worshipping philosophy that the existentialists were effectively rebelling against. Here we see one of those critical early rebellions where Kierkegaard, boom, is pushing back way hard against a couple important notions in Hegel's idealist philosophy. And I think this warrants a quick tour of those ideas.
There have been places and periods of history when only a congenital optimist could have had any hope for the future of our species. Think of the end of Athens' golden age, the fall of the Roman Empire, the petering out of the Renaissance, the end of the Enlightenment, the rise of fascism. It's when things look bleak indeed that it pays to remember the German 19th century philosopher Hegel. In his lectures on the philosophy of world history, published in 1830, Hegel offered us a way of looking at the darker periods of history that neither glosses over their pain nor refuses to give up hope, but intelligently helps us to understand why human progress cannot be linear, while encouraging us to trust that it does occur nevertheless. For Hegel, history moves forward in what he termed a dialectical way. A dialectic is a philosophical term for an argument made up of three parts: a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. Both the thesis and the antithesis contain parts of the truth, but they are also exaggerations and distortions of the whole, and so need to clash and interact until their best elements find resolution in a synthesis. One cannot, in short, get there in one leap. Hegel thought this pattern constantly observable in history. The world makes progress by lurching from one extreme to another as it seeks to overcompensate for a previous mistake, and generally requires three moves before the right balance on any issue can be found. So, for example, the ancient Athenians discovered the idea of individual liberty, but their regime was blind to the need for collective discipline and organization. The ancient Persians knew all about that and were thereby able to conquer the Athenians on the battlefield. Yet they were also despotic enemies of free thought, which with time became its own liability. It took many centuries for the correct synthesis between liberty and discipline to be worked out in the form of the Roman Empire. In Hegel's own era, the stifling, unfair 18th century system of inherited traditional monarchy had been abolished by the French Revolution. But what should have been the peaceful birth of representative government ended up in the anarchy and chaos of the Terror. This, in turn, led to the emergence of Napoleon, who restored order but became a military brute, trampling on the liberty he had professed to love. Only after 40 years and much bloodshed did the modern balanced constitution emerge, an arrangement which more sensibly balanced up popular representation with the rights of minorities. Or, to take another example, the European Enlightenment had stressed the importance of reason, but it had in many parts been sterile and reductive. The movement known as Romanticism had then swept in to assert the importance of emotion, but this had carried excesses of its own. Only eventually had a correct reconciliation been worked out between the legitimate competing needs of reason and emotion. Hegel's argument has a highly reassuring feel at moments when it seems that one kind of progress has been entirely lost. He is on hand to reassure us that we're merely seeing the pendulum swing back for a time, but also wisely counselled that this was needed because the initial move forward had been blind to a range of crucial insights. All sides on a matter will contain important truths lodged amidst exaggeration and bombast. Yet these truths will eventually be sifted out through the wisdom of time. Hegel reminds us that big overreactions are eminently compatible with events broadly moving forward in the right direction. The dark moments aren't the end. They are a challenging, but even in some ways necessary parts of an antithesis that will eventually find a wiser point of synthesis.
So hopefully by thinking back to the Kierkegaard video versus that Hegel video, you can see a bit of what Kierkegaard was rebelling against in Hegel. Hegel's essentially saying, look, there is this force, this dialectic, that kind of, I mean, for lack of a better word, it's the motor, the engine of history. And that's how history moves. It moves in each of us, outside of us, in our minds, bodies, souls, the world, the universe. You have this thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And the idea is that this is constantly moving upward. It's a progression, right? Moving to a greater and greater and higher truth. And notice this, because every synthesis is the thesis of a new dialectic, right? You got thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which then becomes a new thesis, antithesis, synthesis, goes on and on and on. It's a constant progression, never a falling back, always, according to Hegel, a progression toward greater truth, greater enlightenment, right? So in a sense, you can see how Kierkegaard was pissed at this philosophy. It's essentially saying, look, even when you are at your worst, don't worry about it. It's another step towards this higher truth. Now, that is that's an uplifting thought. One can find comfort in that thought. I know that I do from time to time. I like Hegel's philosophy, right? But Kierkegaard is essentially saying, hold on, this is way too optimistic. This is not the way we experience our lives. When we're in grief, when we're in anxiety, um, when we are estranged from ourselves, it's not our go-to thinking that this is just another step in the dialectic toward absolute spirit and absolute idea. It's not what happens to us. This is overly rational. It's overly abstract and idealistic. So this is the notion that Kierkegaard is rebelling against, that everything's moving toward Hegel's ultimate truth known as absolute idea or absolute spirit. I couldn't help myself. I found this on the internet. Moving on. A few notes about Kierkegaard, just on the general human situation. So, like Hegel, Kierkegaard conceives of human reality as a clash of opposites, but he doesn't think that these disparities can always be resolved through rational mediation or through the movement of history. Like, remember from the video where the opposition was between passion and sex on the one hand and stability in marriage on the other hand. Those could be like the thesis and the antithesis. Hegel would say, well, now we can have them both. That is the synthesis. And Kierkegaard is saying, no, they are eternally opposed. And you have to just settle into this ambiguity. You're not going, it's, things aren't moving towards a synthesis on a constant basis. We have to embrace the opposition and be able to cope with the ambiguity that results from that. So for him, there's a deep and unresolvable tension between the abstract speculative outlook on reality found in Hegel's philosophy and the concrete circumstances of a person who's attempting to find meaning in his or her life, what he called the existential situation. And in the existential situation, we find ourselves to be finite and temporal beings, right? We're going to die and we live in time, not outside of it. That's what it means to be temporal. Who are confronted with the demand to impart an infinite and eternal significance to our lives. That's the human situation. That's the ultimate absurdity. Here we are, limited, finite, mortal, time-based creatures who obviously feel the need to charge our lives with infinity and eternal significance. That's our ultimate conundrum, if you will, right? So our nature is both temporal or time-based and eternal, which is outside of time. And this is absurd. And we have to embrace it, Kierkegaard would say. Not try to escape it with philosophies like, for instance, Hegel's. Another important set of Kierkegaardian ideas, if you will, are his spheres of existence, right? Which are the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. So the aesthetic level has to do with particular pleasure and pain, you know, aesthetics not meaning art, but like feelings, right? Sensations. Then the ethical, which is general considerations of good and evil, right and wrong. And then there is the religious sphere, which he referred to as sin and grace kind of synthesized, right? Not synthesized in the sense of Hegel, but um, making peace with the ambiguity. So, three different spheres of existence that you can occupy. And, you know, essentially, if you look out at any big group of people, you'll see some people who are living in this sphere, some who are living in this one, and some who are living, very few, he would say, living in this one. Be careful when it says religious. Don't picture necessarily church and communion and um, and all of the trappings of religion. He means this slightly um, differently. Right? This is supposed to be the highest phase for him, and he does. It doesn't mean that it's because you go to church every Sunday and say, you know, grace at dinner. It's something very more profound to Kierkegaard. Just as a note, let's look at each of these in turn. So the aesthetic, the realm of the senses, right? That's the sphere of immediacy. And he says the one that most of us live the majority of our lives in: sensing, eating, smelling, touching, tasting, hearing, experiencing. Right? In the aesthetic sphere, someone is living for these sensations and feelings, and they're chasing the next one consistently. And once one is over, the kind of the bottom drops out from them, and they're looking for the next one. So they are, in a sense, a slave to feelings and sensations. And Kierkegaard called them slaves. It's a slavish existence to live your life entirely in the aesthetic sphere of existence, he would say. Um, when you do live that way, he said, your purposes are exhausted by the satisfaction of desires for momentary or short term fulfillments. And Kierkegaard thinks that the aesthetic option, and he thought it was an option. You can choose to try to live this way too. Some people just do by default, or you can choose it. But if you choose it, he says it's always going to be a failure as a route to fulfillment, because whether these satisfactions are actually secured is very often outside of your control, and hence it's plagued with anxiety. It's all coming from outside. The stimuli, the sensations and experiences are delivered from without and not from within. So they're dependent upon a constantly changing set of circumstances and fortune and luck in many instances. So anxiety over whether or not you're going to get to the next sensational experience plagues the aesthetic sphere, Kierkegaard would say. And further, the anxiety that plagues this sphere, it undermines that sensation of well-being that is the aim of the aesthetic life in the first instance. So it ends up being an exercise in futility. You're looking for a sense of well-being that comes from all of these sensational pleasures, but because of the uncertain nature of all of these sensational pleasures, it comes with anxiety, which is the opposite of well-being. So it's like a snake biting its tail. So in short, the aesthetic life expresses only the temporal or the time-based side of our nature. It ignores the eternal side. And remember, Kierkegaard said, we are a strange mixture of both. Then there's the ethical sphere of existence. And he described this as the sphere of requirement and resignation. And resignation can also sound like I'm resigning from my job, right? Or I give up. I don't think this is the way you should interpret resignation. It's more an acceptance of fate as opposed to a giving up. So if anything, just kind of, if you use this word resignation as like, I'm a loser, I give up, just kind of loosen that up a little bit. Um, in the ethical sphere, the past is understood as repentance, and the future is understood as obligation. And that's kind of strange, but he's saying that you are people who live in the ethical sphere. This is the, for lack of a better word, mindset that they're in as they move through the world. They're not chasing sensational experiences from one to the next. They're looking at the past to see what they kind of did wrong and what could be better, and taking that and seeing it as an obligation toward behavior in the future. It's an entirely different way of engagement in the world. He called these, remember, he called people who live in the aesthetic sphere slaves. He called people who occupied the ethical sphere knights of resignation. They are resigned to this sort of time traveling between past and future, and requirement and resignation. And he said entrance into this sphere requires a leap of will. That's an exercise of free choice and thus an individuating act. It's a highly conscious act. Kierkegaard called this attempt to express the eternal aspect of the self by one's will alone defiance. Now, admittedly, a lot of this is trying to wrap your head around. If you are interested in this, see the book Either or, and also Fear and Trembling. Right, but we'll just continue here with some of these qualities of the ethical sphere. So living in the ethical sphere constitutes the constantly renewed decision to play the game in which the categories of moral good and evil operate. It is a decision. It's not something that you are just driven to do by your pleasure and pleasure seeking and pain avoidance mechanisms. So here, the essence of the moral is the universal and exceptionless nature of its rules, and the essence of the immoral consists in considering yourself an exception to these rules. I'm thinking like Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. And if you're unfamiliar with that, it's okay. So to round this out, the choice to live a life in the ethical sphere is going to fail, he says, because, quote unquote, the self in its despairing effort to will to be itself labors itself into the direct opposite. It becomes really no self, which, to make any kind of sense of this out of the context of these works here, is, I guess I could explain this as saying, while the self is trying to make a decision to kind of leap out of, let's say, the aesthetic sphere and strip out a lot of that content and live more according to universals and rational, exceptionless rules, you think that by doing that, you are really making yourself an individual. I'm denying all my baser urges, and I'm setting these rules upon myself. And this is what really makes me an individual, and it's an exercise in will. What Kierkegaard is saying is that no, what you're really doing is you're stripping all of the particulars out of your nature, or attempting to, that actually make you what you are. So this is futile as well. And then there's the religious sphere of existence. And that's the sphere of, he says, total commitment and fulfillment and a true synthesis of the particular and general. And this is the sphere where he says truth is subjectivity. Now, by this, he doesn't mean to deny that there are objective facts about the world that are true independently of our ways of knowing them. He's not trying to say that. He's not trying to say, that if you say what goes up must come down, he's not trying to say, well, that's just subjective. Rather, truth is subjectivity means that when issues regarding meaning and fulfillment in one's life are at stake, one's attitude toward the objects of one's concerns takes precedence over the issue of whether one is actually right about some fact. So this truth, if you've ever said the words my truth, that's my truth. Certainly you wouldn't say that if I dropped my coffee cup off the table and it smashed, and you said to me, you just smashed that coffee cup by pushing it off the table. I wouldn't use that terminology. I would be like, well, that's your truth, but my truth is something else. Or, that's pushing it, right? That's not what they're talking about here, but there is certain aspects of truth that are subjective. And so I'm just really trying to connect that to those notions of where you'll talk about my truth, right? It doesn't mean that it's in opposition to like scientific facts out there, but there's a different level of truth that he is talking about here that runs parallel to sort of scientific truths. And entrance into this sphere requires a leap of faith that is the ultimate exercise of free choice and thus the highest act of individuation. And he called the people who occupy this sphere knights of faith. And he uses the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, if you're familiar, to illustrate this. And that's a painting of that. So I'll try to put it on quicker blast here. Some more ideas, right? I'm not just unpacking a reading. I'm giving you some random thoughts of Kierkegaard's that really caught people's attention. Despair. Kierkegaard describes 3 unsuccessful ways of managing our human predicament as despair, or the sickness unto death, right? First stance is to be unaware of the problem and live a life of indifference to the most fundamental tension in one's being. He described it as not being conscious of having a self and named it despair, improperly so called. The second stance is to recognize the problem through self-reflection or a blow of fate, but flee from it by immersing oneself in the time-based stuff, in the here and now. He called that despair at not willing to be oneself. And the third stance tries to express the eternal through one's will alone. And he described that as detaching the self from every relation to the power which alone posited it, named it despair at willing to be oneself. But we start to see this acknowledgement of an existential situation, as complex as he makes it sound. He is breaking down real concrete conditions, real existential conditions in his analyses here. Anxiety, also translated as dread or angst, and that's the chronic, disquieting feeling that something not so good is about to happen, or unfocused fear. And Kierkegaard uses the example of a man standing on the edge of a tall building or cliff, right? And that when the man looks over the edge, he experiences a focused, a real fear of falling, but at the same time feels a terrifying impulse to throw himself intentionally off the edge. And that experience is anxiety or dread because of our complete freedom to choose to either throw yourself off or to stay put. I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but I certainly could the first time that I read it. And it's kind of what makes you dizzy. It's like one step and look what could, right? And there's some existential acknowledgement of how easy it would be once you're just standing right here. And he's saying that this is like a perfect paradigm of how free we are, right? And he trying to kind of freeze frames this moment in capturing this experience of anxiety. Right? The mere fact that one has the possibility and freedom to do something, even the most terrifying of possibilities, triggers immense feelings of dread. And this concept of anxiety, especially the way he breaks it down, is going to be an important concept for future existentialist thinkers. The dizziness of freedom. What's our task in the middle of all of this craziness, right? All of this despair, anxiety, spheres of existence. What's our task? Our task, he says, is becoming authentic individuals. And he says the task of the subjective thinker is to transform himself into an instrument that clearly and definitely expresses in existence whatever is essentially human. So for Kierkegaard, this means the expression of our existence as a synthesis between the temporal and eternal aspects of our nature, which he admits is difficult. Remember, this is what he said. We are time-based and eternal. Time-based things yearning for infinity and eternality. They are contradictory, and we have to be able to keep a footing in each of those camps and not try to overcome it, but deal with it and realize it. And if we can realize it, this expression becomes an overarching purpose or theme for our entire lives, coping with these oppositions. And by that, we become a unity. We become whole, he said. To have been young and then grow older and finally to die is a very mediocre form of human existence, he said. This merit belongs to every animal, but the unification of the different stages of life is the task set for human beings. So for Kierkegaard, becoming authentic means making a fully deliberated choice to insert project here, right? You can't tell you that. It's a subjective choice, but a fully deliberated choice and commitment and resignation to be something and not just be what your particular society has to offer you. Mm. That's okay. Few more here. So the present age and on the death of rebellion, some of his considerations and criticisms of the time in which he lived, which certainly wasn't this time, but Kierkegaard described his social and intellectual landscape thusly. A revolutionary age is an age of action. Ours is the age of advertisement and publicity. Nothing ever happens, but there is immediate publicity everywhere. And this is back in the early 1800s. In such an environment, meaning is evacuated, thought and discourse are replaced by talkativeness, everything is reduced to a kind of private public gossip, and real content is miserably limited because of its intensity and self-absorption. Again, he could be writing about today. This is the 1800s. It really gives you something to think about. This cultural malady in its infancy, when Kierkegaard described it, has reached maturity with the ascendance of network technologies that make everything instantly public. Its effects are felt everywhere. And this refers to today. This is kind of my commentary here. Present age. characterless and envy. Misundels, excuse me, misundels is the word that he used, and it literally means not to grant something to the other. And the antonym would be bewundering, which is admiration. So he says in modern society, envy takes the form of characterless envy, like kind of like jealousy. So, for example, he said in ancient Greece, envy was endowed with character. If you became envious of somebody who had something or was something that you weren't, you aspired to be what they were and to do what they did so that you could become more like them and become excellent. You said this person is better than me at this, that, the other, or in general. And you're acknowledging that their excellence and how they excel over you. He said his time is an empty envy that no longer has the character to come to an awareness of its own significance, meaning the significance of the envy itself. That all it is this yucky, flattened feeling of, of envy and jealousy and disdain without the aspirational content that came prior, he said. It used to be a prompt to like, hey, if I'm feeling envious, then there must be something I'm lacking that maybe I can start to do to build up. Maybe this is telling me something about myself. He's saying that his modern reflective age, it's flattened out and it's just a feeling. It's not a prompt toward excellence any longer. Such a characterless envy does not recognize excellence. It suppresses not only the excellence which is, but that which is to come, he says. Now, wrapping it up on the public and the media. Kierkegaard says an age devoid of passion will become progressively more degenerate. With a scarcity of ideas to concern itself with, the press or the media will provide only sensual stimulation, which lasts only momentarily and poses an even greater danger. The crowd becomes sluggish, unwilling to undertake anything on its own, and the significance of human activities is reduced to their being fodder, food, for the entertainment of the crowd. And those individuals who are actually the productive ones, like public officials, teachers, more intelligent journalists, are looked upon as horses who strain to carry along the sluggish masses. Once again, this is him talking about the press or the media in the early 1800s. We're talking newspapers. And the corrupt Roman emperors are symbolic of the attitude of the masses, bored and looking only for variety. And so that's his assessment. That's a big sampling of Kierkegaard's ideas. And thanks for hanging out through all of that. Again, they came from all different sorts of myriad readings, but it's touched on a lot of Kierkegaardian ideas here. I wanted to close with the notion of the looking glass self. And that's a term that was coined by American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley in 1902. And that concept describes the process wherein individuals base their sense of self on how they believe others view them. Using social interaction as a type of mirror, people use the judgments they receive from others to measure their own worth, values, and behavior. Now, again, Kierkegaard didn't originate this idea, but you can see it brewing in Kierkegaard, right? And it's to come not that long after. Of course, we remember this from last week, and this is Narcissus staring at himself in a pool, and there's our Black Mirror stuff.